Yo, what is going on, guys? Welcome back. Today in this video, we are going to do an ultimate elemental guide. So if you have any questions about how elemental effects work, which characters are the best, which enemies to face with specific elemental effects, which one have the most resistance or weaknesses to elemental effects, no worries, I got you. We're going to cover all that in today's video. Of course, if you enjoy the video, be sure you hit that thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, consider subbing for more Gotham Knights content. And of course, if I forget anything, if you even have specific builds for elemental effects that you want to share with the community, yo, let us know in the comments. First, let's start with the basics. What are elemental effects? They're basically secondary effects that either apply a specific effect to an enemy or a specific damage type to an enemy. Now, there are 5 different types of elemental effects. We have incendiary, cryogenic, bioelectric, concussive, and toxic. Now, these 5 can be found on different varieties of suits, melees, or ranged weapons. There are specific elemental effects that do kind of favor specific characters. We're going to talk about those, but those are pretty much the basic. If you want a specific elemental effect, well, you need to find that melee weapon or ranged weapon that has that effect towards the enemies. Or if you want resistance, you need to look for the suit that has that same elemental resistance. There are also mods that do give extra elemental resistance for specific ones, and you can get them from the heroic side of the mods on the suit. And then specific elemental buildup, which is what we will talk about here in a little bit. You can find those on the melee or ranged weapons, and they have like a little elemental effect in it, and it gives you a specific amount of elemental buildup. Now, every single character has skills that have elemental effect bonuses to it, but out of all the characters, the god of elemental effects is Robin. So if you like using elemental effects, I would certainly consider using Robin. He has so many skills that help him with the elemental effects. His decoy, for example, give elemental lingering effects. Any enemy that walks into it gets elemental effects. You have any elemental effect that's on an enemy, you get increased crit rate, crit damage. Robin's elemental skill tree, in which he gets 25% faster elemental buildup. He also has elemental effect resistance increased by 40%. He also has effects that last twice as long and other elemental effects bonuses with his skill. So if you like elemental, all characters you can use elemental effects, but Robin is definitely the character that uses it to the best of its abilities. Now, depending on what mods you have equipped and which gear you have equipped, it's going to affect the elemental buildup. Now, we'll get to, in just a second, some gameplay that shows you what elemental buildup is and how to check it. So this, depending on the number of your elemental buildup, it's going to affect how fast the meter increases to where the elemental effect actually triggers. So keep that in mind. And there's also enemies and that are resistant or have weaknesses to specific elements. We're going to go into that in just a second. Now, just to show you what elemental effects are and how they're applied to enemies, you're going to notice a little circular bar or meter that's above the enemies when you hit them with an elemental effect weapon, whether it be ranged or melee. I'm going to just use melee, and you see that little toxic right above the 42? That is the buildup. You keep throwing it at them until that buildup meter goes to the top. And then once it goes to the very top, then that elemental effect then happens. And so that guy right there is affected with toxic right now because the elemental effect has been to the max. It reached the top of the bar. And so that's how elemental effects apply. They do specific things depending on whether or not it's toxic or concussive or anything like that. Get him fully affected. Now he has the toxic, and you'll see like smoke or little toxic fumes coming from him. That means he's taking damage from toxic while that toxic effect is applied. And so that's how elemental buildup works. And like I said, once that meter does hit that maximum amount and that elemental effect is then applied, it's going to change depending on whether or not it's toxic or incendiary or bioelectric. Concussive is the one that's a little bit different, being that the fact it doesn't apply damage to them. All it does is stun them, which means that it doesn't, obviously they can't move or anything. So the other ones do apply some sort of secondary damage effect, but when this thing is finally triggered, and then concussive just stuns them. Now let's talk about the elemental effects and the groups of enemies that you're going to face in Gotham Knights. Now there are currently 6 different groups of enemies, and being that the heroic assault is going to come, we don't know if maybe one week it's going to be straight mob, and then the next week is going to be court of owls, or if it's going to do all sorts of different ones. But either way, I think this is important to know when you're talking about elemental builds, because you might want to do multiple different elemental builds. Now, every elemental effect can still apply towards the enemies. Just because it shows that they're resistant to it, I have found that you can still apply elemental effects to them. It just certainly takes a lot longer. The ones that have weakness, the elemental builds up obviously much quicker, and the elemental effects apply very, very rapidly. If you have, say, a toxic build and you go against the freaks, even on very high, you will kill them and, defeat the enemy in any activity super quick. But either way, these are the enemies. We got League of Shadows, resistant to toxic, but weakness incendiary, court of owls, toxic, cryogenic, mob, concussive, bioelectric. You kind of get, hopefully you understand the point. Each enemy is resistant to one single elemental effect, and every enemy also has a weakness to one elemental effect. Now, the general rule of thumb is what elemental effect the enemies apply to you, which has to do with your suit, and your elemental resistance is going to be which ones they are resistant to. So for example, League of Shadows, general rule is that they do toxic damage. They're also resistant to toxic. If you look at regulators, they do bioelectric damage and is resistant to bioelectric elemental effects. There are a couple exceptions to this rule, and one of them is the bulldozers from the regulators. They actually apply concussive as well. They actually apply 2 elemental effects. And then in the League of Shadows, there are a few enemies that do incendiary damage, even though their weakness is incendiary. They do incendiary damage. But all the other ones, I found that the damage that they do is actually whatever they are resistant to. So keep that in mind when you are placing your suit and you're going against these specific groups of enemies. The damage they do, the type of elemental effect they do is going to be what they're resistant to. And the one that's going to have the best effect for your melee and ranged weapon is going to be whatever weakness they have. So when you are crafting your weapons, keep this in mind on the elemental effects. Not just the toxic bow staff or the modular elemental effect bow staffs, for example, for Robin, are going to be the only ones that do elemental effects. There's going to be other ones that also do it. But keep in mind that when you're coming up with your build, for example, like the toxic is going to be really good against the freaks, which means if you have this bow staff, you should be getting through any very high level activity versus the freaks really quick. Court of Owls, League of Shadows, toxic is not going to really apply very easily. And so it's not going to do as good a damage. When you compare like bow staffs or whatever, we have toxic bow staff, and then we have the modular toxic bow staff. I have found that the modular ones are just not as good, at least my personal opinion, even though that they have 4 mod slots. The conditional stats of the regular bow staffs are always better, and it does more damage. And so you can apply an extra on the modular for the extra buildup, which is useful. Don't get me wrong, it definitely is useful to have extra buildup when you apply those mods to it. but the damage is much better on the regular ones instead of the modular ones, and the conditional stats are also better on the regular ones as opposed to modular. Also might be a good idea when you come up with your build is maybe do 2 different ones. Maybe do a melee that is concussive and then a ranged weapon that is toxic. Having both of the same kind of certainly puts you at an advantage for specific enemies, but then puts you at a disadvantage for specific enemies. And so if you want to have like more variety, you can do 1 melee with 1 different elemental effect and then the ranged weapon with a different elemental effect. That way you kind of have a advantage over multiple enemies. Also keep on the lookout when you're doing your builds, the elemental momentum abilities that do affect elemental effects. Every single character has them, you know, like for Robin, he has the little one where he shoots up the fireworks or whatever. Batgirl has one where she's really good with concussive and heavy melee, along with her little hack where she does bioelectric elemental effects. So doing builds like that, it's always good to keep those in mind when you're coming up with your builds. One thing I love about this game is just the amount of diversity that it provides in your builds with each specific character. There's not one thing that you can do with only one character and it probably be considered the best. Every situation can be different and you can make one build just as good as another build. So I certainly appreciate that. But anyways, that is your ultimate guide to the elemental effects. Everything that it does, how to see it or notice it, how it affects the enemies, which enemies are affected by what elemental effects, and maybe some guidance on doing your builds. If I left anything out, please let me know in the comments as well. Also, I'm certainly curious. Please post your best elemental build with one particular character, the mods and the gear and all of that stuff. And I'm also curious on your elemental buildup number, just to see, you know, and compare it towards everything else. But either way, that's going to do it. Hit the thumbs up if you did enjoy, and hopefully this did help you and maybe set straight on some questions you had about elemental effects. I will see y'all next time. Hopefully y'all had a good weekend. We are out. Peace.